Across the Fence, I'll talk with the author of a new book on the history of slavery, the Underground Railroad, and the Abolitionist Movement in New Hampshire. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. Our guest today is an accomplished writer from Newbury, Vermont, who has written extensively about slavery and about the Civil War. She's been in the newspaper business for 30 years. She works now at the journal Opinion, a weekly paper based in Bradford. Her books include Abolition and the Underground Railroad in Vermont and the St. Albans Raid. Her new book is entitled Slavery and the Underground Railroad in New Hampshire. It is a pleasure to welcome Michelle Arnosky Sherburne. Thanks so much for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Now, you open your new book discussing New Hampshire's hidden history. What do you mean by that?
Well, I found when I was researching the Underground Railroad that a lot of things had been rewritten, images had been changed, and that was something that needed to be shared. I found that they were historians after the Civil War in the late 1890s were writing town histories all across New England, and they didn't want to have a negative image after the Civil War, so they didn't want to mention slavery or anything negative.
Now, you have a term for that. It's called historical amnesia.
Exactly.
Which I thought was pretty appropriate. And so tell me a little bit about what you found out as far as the slave trade in New Hampshire and ships out of Portsmouth.
Well, that I hadn't realized until I started digging that Portsmouth, New Hampshire was a shipbuilding city, and it was receiving imports all the time. So one of those imports were slaves, and as you see here, this was a slaver, it was called, but not necessarily a slave ship like we think of them, being layered and having huge with thousands of slaves on them. Portsmouth was producing fast ships that could travel quickly, go to Africa, pick up imports as like spices and sugars and slaves. So they were bringing back slaves, and I researched about the ships and how many were coming back and selling the slaves. It wasn't just one or two. Right. So that
it was a going concern.
Yes, it was. And Portsmouth was supplying New England and also the South with slaves. So it wasn't just a casual gathering. And in the city itself of Portsmouth, you had records of slave auctions and slave sales. Like this is the William Pitt Tavern in Portsmouth, where they would have in the newspaper advertisements for an auction, and there's also the Studley's Tavern. I may have reversed those, but these are images. These taverns had regular slave sales, and we don't think of that in New England.
Right. Talk a little bit about where the slaves come from too, because I think people don't realize maybe that these were children that were often taken from their families, kidnapped, adults who did not want to leave.
Oh yes, the term that came up when I was doing the research was unwilling immigrants, because slaves were kidnapped from their home. Right. There was no one came willingly, and the Portsmouth slaves that came were children, because it was found that it was easier to mold a child and start with them as a child, but all the slaves that came from Africa were kidnapped. They were taken against their will and brought into slavery.
Now, you also researched the Underground Railroad in Vermont and published a book about that. Can the same issues of altered history also be said about Vermont?
Yes, definitely. I found that in both states, New Hampshire was tried for the lily white image. They tried to portray that they didn't have slavery when they actually did. In Vermont, it was politically known as the anti-slavery state. So there's this image of Vermont being welcome to fugitive slaves, to blacks during the 1800s. And yes, there were blacks that lived in Vermont, and there have been a number of books written about the lives of blacks. The problem was, the more I researched, the more I found negative responses, persecution and prejudice, and that's what's been altered, is that this image of it being safe and a haven really wasn't so.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the book you mentioned a network. Can you explain how the Underground Railroad worked, specifically in Vermont or New Hampshire?
Yes, Underground Railroad, it worked the same in every state in the North. The whole objective was to move fugitive slaves northward. The goal was to get out of the country, because out of the country is where slavery didn't exist. So Canada was your first target. Some went over to Europe. And the network part, there's been a lot of discrepancies about the Underground Railroad, and it was not a managed organization. It was people knowing other people who would help fugitive slaves. And after a while, if you used the same pattern, it became kind of a network or a route. And that's how it worked in Vermont, and that's how it worked in New Hampshire, exactly the same.
Now, there are some connections that you write about in the book that have to do with Vermont as well.
Yes. With the two sister states, basically, you have a lot of crossover. So when I was doing the Vermont book, I had to mention New Hampshire, and when you're doing the New Hampshire book, you have to mention Vermont. One of the big things would be the fact that during the 1830s up through the Civil War, there was the Abolitionist Movement, which was started by William Lloyd Garrison, who started a newspaper in Massachusetts pushing abolition of slavery, getting rid of it in the country. And Frederick Douglass, as we see here, he himself a fugitive slave, he traveled around New England with a lot of other abolitionists who were going around preaching to people, educating them about the evils of slavery and why the country had to get rid of it. So that was where the abolitionist movement was one of those things where you had Garrison and you had Frederick Douglass and you had a number of these speakers going around Vermont as well as New Hampshire. The famous Vermont Underground Railroad agent was Roland Robinson in Ferrisburgh. Now, he hosted many of these speakers, and right now we see a picture of Nathaniel Peabody Rogers, who was out of Plymouth, New Hampshire, which is very close to our Vermont border, and he worked with the man that we saw previously. That was Edmund Carleton in Littleton, New Hampshire. Rogers ran a newspaper, Herald of Freedom, in Concord, New Hampshire, and he traveled all around with Garrison and with Douglass, and they all were promoting getting rid of slavery.
And as you mentioned, though, in your book, that wasn't as popular an idea as most people think it would have been.
No, it was not. And that's something that that kind of sets the stage. Because I was reading about these abolitionists and finding that when they went into a town, they were told by businessmen, by the minister in town, you are not welcome here. Because what they wanted to do was rock the boat. They wanted to change the way the country was set up. So that those men who were just talking about slavery, the negative reception they got, it kind of made me understand how dangerous it was and how it wasn't popular to be helping fugitive slaves, which was an illegal act.
Right.
In our country. It was illegal to help someone who was a fugitive.
And so what were some of the common threads that you found?
Well, I found that
there's a sort of different perspective of slavery in the North as far as versus South.
Yes. In the South, we always think of the cotton fields and the slave drivers. And in the North, we think of everybody helping slaves get away from those awful people. And that really wasn't the case. In the North, there was slavery in each of the northern states, and New Hampshire had slavery up into the 1800s. Vermont also had slavery. Harvey Whitfield from UVM wrote a book called The Problems of Slavery in Early Vermont, and it shed a lot of light on the fact that there was slavery, and it was an acceptable thing, but slavery in the sense of one or two. You didn't have a field workers.
Right.
So the thread that you saw was in New Hampshire, they downplayed this. So when you read histories and you read accounts of people who had slaves, they made it sound like, oh, they're our servants, they're our family, we treat them just like our children.
They sleep in our house.
Exactly. And I think in New Hampshire that I found the less slaves, they couldn't have a community. They didn't have a place of respite. So when they were done working, even if it was just out in the carpenter shop with their owner, they had to sleep in an attic or a space in the cellar. They didn't have a place to go to, and they didn't have the community because there were so few of them. And I find that pretty horrible as well.
Tell me a little bit about your research. I mean, it's hard to sort of find the facts to back this sort of thing up because it was so secretive.
It is, and a lot of historians want everything printed out for them. They want everything in black and white. So, and they want it in writing, and that wasn't the case. It didn't matter if you were in Philadelphia, if you were in Maryland, or if you were in Burlington or Virgins. You were very careful at that time to keep any record. So you necessarily didn't have a logbook of how many fugitives. And that kind of documentation that lack of documentation makes it difficult to research. But certain things surface. So that's the kind of thing where a letter will show up. Like earlier we had a picture of Nathaniel Rogers and Garrison. Well, Garrison wrote a letter to Rogers because he was following up on a fugitive slave that he had sent north, and he was checking with Rogers. Well, in that letter, it had a mention of an Edmund Carleton, and we had seen him earlier in the program. Well, Carleton was a known Underground Railroad agent in Littleton, New Hampshire. That letter says that he was. 20 years ago, I may not have found that, but now that has surfaced.
Now, what were some of your personal highlights that you discovered in your research?
Well, some exciting things, I would say, in connection with both New Hampshire and Vermont. In New Hampshire, I learned that Dartmouth College was built on the built on the backs of slavery. The founder, Reverend Eliza Wheelock, came to New Hampshire to start a school for Native Americans to educate them and Christianize them. And here we have a picture of Wheelock. Well, he came with slaves, and he bought and sold slaves, and the slaves are the ones that cleared the land, built the buildings, took care of the college when it was up and running. I didn't know that. The other thing that was of interest was in New Hampshire was a petition by 20 Portsmouth slaves in 1779. And
the actual document is there.
It is. Here is a picture that ran, actually the Concord Monitor was good to let me use this in the book. 20 slaves went to the New Hampshire legislature and said, we think that we should be granted our freedom because Americans just got their freedom in 1776. And it was a well-written document. It was an amazing document, and things like that. In Vermont, I was amazed with the story of Delia Webster. She was born and raised in Virgins, and not many people know about her. Delia Webster, she actually left Vermont and went to Kentucky and bought, here's a picture of her. She is the woman that is with the curly hair. She has the curly hair. The rest of her sisters are surrounding her. And she went to Kentucky and decided that she was going to fight slavery. And she bought a 600-acre farm right on the Ohio River in Kentucky, which was a slave state. And she was helping fugitive slaves escape through that farm.
Well, I'm going to stop you here because that's just part of the all kinds of stories like that in your book, and it's called Slavery and the Underground Railroad in New Hampshire. It's published by the History Press, and you can order the book by calling the publisher at 888-313-2665. As always, we encourage you to ask for the book at your local bookstore or public library as well. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, I'm so pleased to be here, and thank you.
You're welcome. That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.